Well, good afternoon, and thanks for attending our webinar on the subject of returning to the workplace. For those who don't know me, my name is Derek Coleman, and I'm a Senior Regional Director for Reed, running 14 different recruitment specialisms across the Thames Valley area. I'm very glad to say that we've had an amazing turnout today, and looking at the list of attendees, it's great to see so many familiar names, and equally great to see some new ones too. Whichever is the case, on behalf of Reed and our partners from Boys Turner, I'd like to warmly welcome you to our webinar today. Shortly, I'll be introducing you to our cracking guest speakers, so Emma O'Connor and Barry Stanton from Boys Turner, who will be speaking about the return to the workplace. But if I can be so bold, I would just like to take a few minutes of your time to update you on the job market. To say it's been a challenging job market in the last year would be somewhat of an understatement. It has certainly been the most testing market in my 24 years of working for Reed. Most companies, organisations have been in survival mode since last March. Only about 25% of workers are back in the office, although this is definitely increasing as the schools have returned. Fortunately, we have had the furlough scheme, which has protected so many jobs. However, this is coming to an end in September with the threat of rising unemployment. The big question here is, can the UK create enough jobs for the potential job seekers? So how do we measure what's going on in the job market with all these changes? To coin a phrase, how do you measure rainfall in a hurricane? Well, since the beginning of the last recession back in 2009, Reed have been publishing a report called the Job Index, which tracks jobs, applications and salaries from reed.co.uk, the largest job board in the UK. To give you some idea of the scale, there are at least 100,000 jobs listed daily. So we are in a unique position as a recruiter to track the market. Well, what does the report tell us? Well, in this first paragraph, in this first graph, it shows the number of jobs posted. In January 2020, just prior to the pandemic, the index or benchmark was reset at 100. As you can see, the number of jobs advertised reduced substantially as COVID hit and lockdown followed, reducing the job flow to a record low of 33% in April. This meant that in a space of a couple of months, almost 70% of the jobs market had fallen away, leaving mainly key worker roles being posted at this time. I'm glad to say that since then we have seen a consistently improving picture from June to March, recovering to 84% of the market pre-pandemic. In fact, the last quarter has been very steady, showing increasing confidence levels by employers as the vaccine rolls out. Taking a greater look at industries, the stamp duty holiday initiative brought in by the government continues to have a positive impact on the job market, with the construction industry showing growth by 24% over the last 2 months, and estate agency jobs growing by 32% over the same time. Unsurprisingly, with the opening of pubs, restaurants and hotels, I hear a slight cheer in the background there, we have seen a 77% improvement of jobs in the hospitality industry. However, the greatest growth in the last couple of months has come in the leisure and tourism industry, with 3 times the number of jobs being advertised as this industry gets back on its feet. Let's hope we can all go away in the summer. Looking at job seekers, the number of applicants applying for each job has almost doubled between January and July, as those seeking employment in the UK surged from 1.1 million, a 40-year low, to 2.7 million. However, and probably the most interesting statistic in my presentation, is the number of applicants applying for roles in the last 4 months has dropped below pre-COVID levels, suggesting applicants are seeking job security and staying in their roles at this time. If you are an employer looking for staff or thinking about employing, you may find it a little harder than you may first have thought. And if we can help you in any way, please feel free to contact any of my offices or me directly. Now, onto our guest speakers. Emma O'Connor and Barry Stanton will shortly run through their presentation, giving insights into returning to the workplace. During their presentation, please feel free to pose questions in the chat option on your screen. Hopefully, we'll have enough time at the end to go through them all. We will also be sending a link out of the recording after the event too. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Emma O'Connor, who's just been promoted as a director and head of training, and Barry Stanton, head of employment team and partner at Boyce Turner. Over to you, Emma and Barry.
Thank you, Derek, for that introduction and some really interesting data and observations there. So thank you for that. And thank you to those who are joining us live and also to our listeners who are listening again. As Derek said, I'm Emma O'Connor. I'm a director and head of HR training in the employment team, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Barry Stanton, who is a partner and also head of the employment team. So hi, Barry.
Hello, Emma. Hello, everyone.
Just to say, Barry and I are here. We are off camera. That's not because we're camera shy at all. It's just for production purposes. So for those who don't know Boyce Turner, we are a commercial law firm in Reading, and we service organisations and businesses across the Thames Valley, the UK, EU, and also globally. Our employment team offers advice and support on HR matters, litigation, business, immigration, as well as training and coaching. Now, when Derek invited Barry and I to come and talk to you today, we were discussing what topics that we wanted to talk about, and also what issues that our clients are facing, and also what's happening in the wider HR and people management space as we move forward with the government's reopening roadmap. Although businesses and sectors are in different places, there are some themes that seem to be impacting on businesses, isn't there, Barry?
Yes, that's right, Emma. Some businesses will have been physically open to a greater or lesser extent during the whole of 2020 and for the first part of 2021. Some other businesses may have had a skeleton staff on site, with the vast majority working in some form of remote way. However your business has been working, there have been challenges. But from challenge comes opportunity. Another key feature over the last year has been the government schemes and support available. And of course, the JRS scheme has had a huge impact on the workforce. And as we move forward to the phasing out of JRS from July through to the end of September, we'll look at how this will impact on workforce planning.
But if we take a snapshot and think where we were in the summer of 2020, and if we think about the success we've had with the vaccination, the rollout programme, I think, you know, reopening workplaces is going to take some planning. There's going to be a lot of communication. But if we adopt the government's cautious but irreversible approach, there is much to consider both in the short and long term. What I will say is that for businesses, if you start thinking now about how you want your workplaces and your workspaces to look, you will be better placed. So
if we can move on to the next slide, Derek.
Actually, we just, okay, that's fine.
Sorry, but just some admin before we start. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions. So if we have time, we'll take questions. But if not, please complete the feedback form or get in touch with Emma and me via our contact details, which Reed will send to you. I also want to stress that this is an overview based on what we know as at the date of the broadcast. But as always, if you need specific advice, then you really do need to take that specific advice.
Absolutely, thanks for that bit of housekeeping, Barry. So where are we, Barry, when we talk about returning to work?
Well, we're still working under the work from home unless you cannot order, although the if you cannot piece has evolved over time to include those who cannot perform their job because of the nature of their work, so people in retail or construction, for example, but also it will include those who need to come to a workplace for other reasons. So, for example, if it's better for their health and well-being or other individual circumstances. And I'm very conscious that we hear a lot at the moment in the press around well-being for in children and people, being isolated for so long is really difficult. So in terms of when the order might change, the government have confirmed that guidance to work from home where possible will remain in place until 21st of June at the earliest. And a week before that date, a review will be published that will inform the latest advice on working from home.
Now, this webinar is actually quite timely because last week the ONS published some really interesting statistics and data around changing patterns and the changing nature of work, really, and where people have been working. What were some of those statistics, Barry?
Yes, that's right. The ONS published its report on home working rewards and opportunities in the period 2011 to 2020. And as may be expected, the report found that of the employed population, almost 36% did some work at home in 2020, which was an increase of 9.5% compared with 2019. It also found that the average gross weekly pay of workers who had recently worked from home was about 20% higher in 2020 than those who had never worked from home in their main job previously. There were also other interesting statistics around pay, benefits and bonuses, and very happily share a link with you to that report.
No, absolutely. Some really interesting data, particularly around bonuses for people who worked from home primarily and other individuals who perhaps were not able to work from home. But if we turn our attention back to those sorts of issues and challenges that we're hearing from our clients and what we're reading about, let's have a think about where the law might help us, but also have a look at where some of those opportunities are for businesses when we think about returning to site.
So if we can advance the slide, I think we need to go on to, do we have I don't think we have the report on the stats, but from the ONS report, there's been an increase in office-based staff working from home in 2020. And as we start to think about returning to site, I suppose the first question is, do we need a site? Can organisations operate and survive without having a physical base element?
Well, I think, the simple answer to that would be yes. Many businesses, I think at the moment are really thinking about, the bricks and mortar and asking themselves, do we need this? Do we need this space? And is it an expense that we could do without? Could we think about perhaps remodeling our workplaces to be more efficient? But of course, whether this model works for your business will of course depend on the nature of your business, your clients, your sector, but also your workplace culture. And if we think about other organizations, many colleagues, may never meet each other face to face or do so rarely. And some businesses operate completely virtually and have been very successful, or perhaps they have certain teams that work together or perhaps collaborate more face to face than other teams. And I mean, even before COVID, I was reading a lot about hubs, so businesses that would come together in a sort of a shared collaborative space to, collectively bounce ideas off of one another or develop new ones. And perhaps we might see this type of arrangement where smaller organisations or specific teams might come together for the purpose of ideas rather than presenteeism.
Yes, I think that's right, Emma. And certainly our property team is working with a number of businesses exploring ways of better managing their office spaces, whether that be leasehold or freehold. And particularly with leasehold space, they're talking a lot about re-gearing, so allowing businesses to shrink their spaces more rapidly without any additional cost to them in terms of the lease. So I do think we'll see a shift in how businesses manage their office space and their properties. And everyone I've talked to over the last 5 or 6, 8 weeks have all been talking about office space and the desire to reduce it.
Absolutely, and I think, as you said, now is a really good time to be thinking about that future workplace and spaces, as well as your workplace and your workforce expectations. And as an organisation, Boys Turner as well has been thinking about that. And I think it's important to have a period of reflection to really kind of thrash out what's worked well over the last year and what has not. Have your virtual team meetings been a success? How could you perhaps replicate those team meetings moving forward? Could you maybe think about using those check-ins and check-outs at the start or the end of meetings to really keep your individuals engaged? And how can we ensure that our juniors have sufficient development and mentoring? This is really a chance for you and your people to work collaboratively, where you can focus on both the future of your workspace and your workplace. And I think really, when we talk about some of those issues, and we've put some of there up on the slide, I think it's really important to think about the messaging and the communication around this. What roles might you need moving forward? What roles potentially might you may not as a business? We don't know at the moment what might happen around sort of social distancing, but certainly something I was reading over the weekend was talking about maybe sort of having a 1 metre rule. Certainly that would be more advantageous to those in the leisure and hospitality sector. And I think, what could that look like for your business in terms of sort of getting people back into work? I think one of the key issues and one of the key messages is really around communication. Having a clear communication plan from the top down. This is a really worrying time still for your people. So having that communication plan in place, maybe thinking about having a survey, a workplace survey, to actually ask your people what are their expectations moving forward. And again, you might be able to factor that into your planning as well. And also have a think about if you are looking to perhaps change some of your processes and your contracts, does that really necessitate some sort of formal change there? So again, really think about following fair processes. So if we just move on to the next slide, that would be great.
So as well as the mechanics of getting staff back to work, there are health and safety and wellbeing issues to consider. Whilst there are COVID-19 health and safety rules, this guidance operates within current health and safety laws and equality legislation. And this means that as well as general risk assessments, employers need to carry out COVID-19 risk assessments in consultation with their workers. So it's going to be important for HR teams to dust off their health and safety policies and see if these need to be updated and communicate whatever they're doing with the staff. So set out the rules and procedures employees have to follow and warn of the consequences if these strict rules are not followed. But we mustn't forget also those workers who are working from home, and it's important to ensure that they undertake appropriate risk assessments or that we carry those out for them. So if they're working on computers, screen displayed assessments, and also just the generic general risk assessments for working around the home.
Absolutely, and just to add to that point as well, and actually it reflects in a recent Employment Tribunal claim that came out with regards to PPE requirements. It's not just any requirements that your organisation has, but also think about whether there's any requirements that your clients may have as well. So really, communicate with your clients, with your customers as well. What obligations might they place on your individuals? So for example, in this case, it involved a delivery driver. So have a communicate as well with your customers. But I think as well as the sort of the general health and safety issues, I think one of the biggest challenges for businesses is going to be around this readjustment piece, about bringing individuals back into that workplace environment. Some of your staff may have been shielding or have real concerns over returning to work, and also what returning to work might look like for them. There's, I would imagine there will be some apprehension and some real anxiety. And also, for those who are perhaps returning from furlough to work physically, and if they've been off work for a considerable amount of time for some individuals, what are we doing to really help those individuals get back into work? So maybe think about some mentoring and some coaching. And we're helping a number of organisations running sort of virtual training and virtual awareness sessions around this return from lockdown, around anxiety, stress, but also leadership awareness of what some of these issues are. So again, happy to sort of send out some information about that. Next slide, please.
So Emma, what reassurances should employers be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is sort of linked to that sort of well-being piece as well. And I think it's really important to be positive. So think about that, all those positive messages and steps that employers and managers and leaders can take and are taking. As I've said, I think staff surveys are a really good idea to engage with your people, but other things, so for example, virtual tours of the office to sort of try and re-engage individuals with what the office looks like and will look like, post-COVID. I expect, businesses will want to really focus on cleaning and on ventilation and hygiene. So again, may want to emphasise this. I'd recommend to you to review and have a look at the Health and Safety Executive's website and also ACAS, because some really good practical tips around returning staff to work safely as the lockdown eases. But also look at your own guidance, as I've said, around risk assessments, health and safety, any client obligations as well, to really support your staff.
Yes, and training as well on health and safety and undertaking risk assessments is another really good way of engaging staff and offering the reassurance, because they're going to be concerned coming out of a situation where they may not have seen people or been in an office location for many months. They'll want to know that things are being done properly and what they can do to protect themselves. And it's also important to think about developing a communication plan for returning employees, and maybe having a working party or a staff survey asking about what staff want to see and what their concerns are about coming back to the office. We've talked about well-being, but think how we can support our people who may have suffered bereavements or who may have health concerns and who may be really concerned about coming back to work. I was talking to a colleague this morning who came in on the train and was standing in the vestibule. Now I suspect it's been a long time since anybody stood in the vestibule of a railway train coming in and out of London on the main Great Western Line. So, those are going to be real concerns about people coming into close contact, because even today you see people in the street and there's that moment of fear as someone walks towards you and you're approaching them. What do I do? How do I deal with this? So it's going to be a really big effort for everybody to get back into a working environment. And also think about whether we can offer any online resources, support or training, for example, to help people back in.
Absolutely. If we just move on to the next slide, and I think really we are going to have to look at what tools perhaps we have under the law to really help and support businesses. If you've got, as we've said, employee assistance schemes, how can this be used to support individuals struggling with this, readjustment of returning to work? Also, as employees are asked to return to work, some may raise concerns for their health and safety, and employers, I think, need to be mindful of workers' concerns, encourage them almost to come forward and discuss their worries as soon as possible, and make sure that those individuals feel that they are listened to, and where we can, that we take necessary action. But Barry, I can see there may well be instances where managers are finding resistance from some about returning to work, and where can the law offer some protection for both workers but also employers in this situation?
So if an employee still does not feel safe enough to return to work, they could inform their employer that they believe going into work presents a serious and imminent risk of danger to their health and safety. And if they're disciplined for this, or dismissed or treated differently, they may be able to claim under the Employment Rights Act. So the first important thing to note is that the employee must have a reasonable belief that the danger is serious and imminent. The second important point is that the danger must be one which the employee could not reasonably have been expected to avert. Now, although unfair dismissal claims normally require the employee to have 2 years service, in order to be eligible, that's not the case with this type of claim because it's a day one right. And in addition, there's no cap on unfair dismissal damages. Now, I think it's important to note there's been a very recent case, which was at the Employment Tribunal, which has just been recently reported. And it involved a gentleman back in March 2020, who said that he didn't want to go to work because he was concerned about coming to the office because his children were at serious risk with underlying health conditions. So he didn't go to work and he was dismissed by his employer. Now, in that claim, he was unsuccessful because the tribunal found that he did not have a genuine belief that there was circumstances of serious and imminent danger. Well, although he did have a genuine belief, it wasn't an objectively reasonable belief to have because the employer had undertaken and followed the government guidance very carefully, and therefore he was at no greater risk going to work than in going out to the shops or going anywhere else. So it wasn't reasonable for him to have that belief that there was a serious and imminent risk to himself of catching COVID. So I think that demonstrates the really important part here of employers doing everything they can to make sure they have a safe workplace and that they communicate what they've done to their employees.
Absolutely, I think that sort of health and safety and record keeping piece is going to be, you know, absolutely vital in being able to successfully defend these claims. But I think, you know, that case shows that although these cases are rare, I would expect that we will see more of these, particularly as we move forward and with offices and workspaces reopening. But I think, you know, when you do have employees raising concerns, I just think it's really important to give employees an opportunity to raise those concerns, ask for individuals to raise them early, and to really, you know, take those concerns seriously and where you can act upon them. But you know, with those individuals that are refusing to come to work, we may end up in a situation where that refusal is unreasonable. So we need to think how we're going to manage this as businesses, and ultimately this could be a failure to follow a reasonable and lawful management request. But again, it's about careful handling and management of these issues, which is really going to be important. And we're going to be looking at running some leadership courses around managing these types of difficult conversations. So again, look out for information about that. Derek, next slide, please. And the hybrid solution. Well, this is a word that's been cropping up for some time, hasn't it? And I'm sure for those listening, you may well have been having discussions amongst yourselves about, you know, how might the office space look and when might we be encouraging people to return. There was actually a recent study published by the Institute of Facilities Management where the majority of UK employees who were surveyed expected that their employer would move to a hybrid working environment. And this research has found that nearly half, so about 44% of the workforce surveyed were planning to return to work 3 days or less a week. The findings also revealed that 63% of those questioned now believe the office to be unnecessary, which was a rise of a fifth since the first lockdown in March last year. So Barry, what do we think? Is hybrid working the way forward?
Well, interestingly, the poll, which surveyed 2,000 office workers across the country in March this year, shows that the demand for hybrid working is particularly prevalent in the younger demographic. So 2/3, 66% of 18 to 24-year-olds admitted that not being offered flexible work patterns would cause them to look for a new job. So there's definitely a generational element to this as well. For those of you who have carried out your own workplace survey, it would be interesting to know if these results are broadly similar. Now, hybrid working also demands a rethink of our HR processes and policies, not just working from home policies, but also around use of IT, booking holidays and performance indicators. And I was seeing today in the press, there's a growing prevalence of employees using their own IT equipment outside of the scope of the policies required by employers. So that's clearly a risk area. But Emma, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you know, when we look at and we think about this hybrid model, I think it's really going to impact on management styles as well. So, you know, how will our managers mix this sort of mix of, you know, sort of virtual and in-person meetings? And, you know, we've been running some leadership courses around managing remote and hybrid teams, and really the focus there was to look at, you know, what have been some of the challenges moving forward, and where are those sort of tips and techniques to improve manager effectiveness and also your team engagement. So, you know, for example, will there be an agreed day when perhaps the whole team or the majority of the team will be present? I think another big issue is around the fair distribution of work and opportunities between those who are perhaps at home or those who are, you know, in work. So how are we going to ensure there's equality of distribution there? Technology is a big issue. So how can businesses ensure that technology is seamless, whether you're in the office or in work? And we also need to think about our workplace culture. If we do have this hybrid mix, could we see a dilution in workplace culture? But I think one of the key issues is really going to be around our new and emerging talents, so our juniors, and how can we support that new talent, that emerging talent, if we're not in the office to train them, mentor them or support them. You know, I remember as a junior lawyer picking up things on the telephone, you know, you almost sort of learn by listening and learn by osmosis, listening to your colleagues. And I think there's a real emphasis as well on, you know, moving away from employee presenteeism to employee contribution, value and output. So again, could we see a change in the way that we conduct our appraisals and also how we measure performance over time?
Yes, absolutely. There are many positives as well as many practical issues for businesses to consider as they transition into this hybrid working model. And again, these will depend on your business and the culture, and not just the culture you had, but the culture you want to have in the new world that we're going to be creating.
Certainly something, and if we move to the next slide, and it's going to be interesting if you're noticing this as well within your own with your own workplaces. Is this the dawn of the sort of the new workplace tribe? And I'm not just talking about those who are working at home or those that are in the office. You know, some managers are managing effectively a 3-tier workforce with people at work, some who have worked throughout the lockdowns, some who are working remotely, but others who are on furlough leave. And as we lift the lockdown and move forward, we need to think about how we're going to bring those employees back to work, particularly those who have been furloughed. And the job retention scheme, as Barry has said, has been extended until the end of December, with some tapering of support from July. And, you know, thinking about those that have been on furlough leave, for some it's going to have been a very long period of time. And if that gradual return to work does mean the ending of furlough, I think we need to think about how we're going to handle this as an organisation.
Yes, many employers are continuing to use rotation or flexible furlough. Some too may be looking at the dates and when they're going to have to start contributing to furlough pay and thinking long term about, you know, the structure of their workforce and how many employees they need to carry on running the business they have.
Yeah, and obviously that will lead us into the next topic in the next slide.
Yes, of course, another issue could be the need to make redundancies, as I alluded to. Although redundancy is a webinar all in itself, just to give you some headlines. If there is a need to reduce headcount, then it's important to plan ahead and think about the need to consult individually and perhaps with numbers, if you've got 20 or more, then collectively. And consultation must begin in good time, especially with collective consultation, as there are legal requirements to be complied with. So think carefully about what this means for your business and workforce planning.
Absolutely. And, you know, when we talk about redundancy, we're talking about roles, but also that situation is genuine. And we need to think, as Barry said, about giving people reasonable warnings, meaningful consultation to those who are affected. But think about those roles that may need to be selected. What's the selection process going to look at? And also we need to really think about considering those alternatives to redundancy, and also including looking for alternative employment for those who are selected. Unfair dismissal, discrimination, protective awards, you know, these are all legal risks that employers will need to take into account, as well as the costs of redundancy pay, statutory redundancy pay, and whether your organisation offers enhanced terms, and also notice pay as well.
Yes, if you'd like any help or advice on redundancies or planning how the business is going to evolve, then please do get in touch with me or the team, as we're offering training to managers and also staff representatives who may be involved in the redundancy process online.
I think another big issue as well when we think about returning to work, if we just click through to the next slide, and this really sort of runs along the sort of the health and safety issue as well, is what other health and safety measures employers may wish to take. And again, you know, much of this is unknown at this time, but certainly I'm sure most of you have been reading or heard about employers wishing to implement a sort of no jab, no job policy, either for existing staff or for new staff. And I think what I would say about that, and again, just sort of talking about it briefly, happy to pick that up with others, you know, outside of this. But I think really, if you're thinking about that, then you really do need to think really carefully as an organisation, because there are, you know, legal, contractual, as well as cultural and ethical considerations, and you know, none more so than the fact that we still in this country have legislation precluding compulsory vaccination. And I think also, you know, the health and safety executive have made clear that vaccination status of a workforce does not impact on the need to follow health and safety obligations or any COVID secure measures. And I think where we will possibly end up is that we will end up in a very limited and very sector specific approach, particularly thinking there about you know, the care sector or those that work with vulnerable individuals. And I think, you know, we're potentially looking there at some sort of legislation. My advice would be to think about your workforce and, as I've said, your sector, and also what sorts of protection and risk assessment that your business needs. I would prefer that employers took a holistic approach where they not only think about COVID secure measures, but perhaps this is an opportunity to rethink your sickness absence rules, your help, your support, your guidance to staff around sickness absence, but also your sick pay schemes as well. So I do think there's an opportunity there to really bring things together and take that sort of overarching approach at this time. But again, if you want to get in touch, or if you've got any concerns as an organisation that you're thinking about introducing such measures, then do get in touch and we can discuss.
And I think also, Emma, there's another big issue around the testing or health and safety information, which is dealing more generally with employees and individuals' data. Employers need to think really carefully about the types of information they hold or intend to hold, how such information will be used, stored and maintained. Although all of you should have privacy notices relating to employees and workers, many may not include at the moment biometric data, simply because on the whole, employers do not carry out testing of this nature or hold such data. So if you're thinking about testing for COVID-19, my advice would be to tell the employees you're doing it, why you're doing it, how and what will be done with this information, because it will be sensitive personal data and you'll need to seek their specific consent to process that data. And with health information, it's important that employers place more emphasis on keeping that information secure and restricting the amount of data being collected, and also restrict the sharing of that data, and making sure it's stored in a place that it has limited access for other people to get at. So maybe only 1 or 2 people in the organisation should have access to it, rather than having it much more generally available.
Absolutely, and I think that data piece, I think many employers have forgotten the value and the importance of not just data generally, but specifically around sensitive personal and health related data. So again, something there to think about. And I think, you know, we've mentioned it as well when we talk about changes, when we talk about home working, but certainly contracts and policies are another area. If we click onto the next slide, where I think employers are really beginning to turn their attention to, and if you're not already, I think it's an area that you do need to think about. As Barry said, you know, dust off your HR policies, dust off your health and safety policy. You know, you might also want to have a look at your holiday policy. You might also want to, as I've suggested, have a think about your sick pay and your sickness absence rules, if you're looking at things in a sort of a holistic approach, but also things around pay, benefits and incentives more generally. Employers may wish to review and revise such schemes or in fact their contractual terms to ensure that they provide the business with that flexibility, I think in not just sort of current crisis situations, but perhaps what might come up in the future.
And another big issue to think about is travel policies and how this might be impacted or restricted. And things that I've seen much more in the last 5 or 6 months are things like layoff, future furlough and deduction from wages clauses in employment contracts, because they need to be reviewed. I mean, I can't remember really when I last saw before the pandemic a layoff clause, but now they're cropping up all the time, because they help and protect the business in the event of a further, hopefully not future shutdown, if we need that at some point. And then a really big issue now that we're looking at coming back into the workplace or coming back to work more normally is home working. What are the rules and expectations? I think a lot of businesses have tried very hard not to have home working and to keep people in the office. But now that we've spent so long working from home, and businesses have seemed to, where people have worked from home, they've survived and in some cases thrived. You know, how's that home working policy going to work? Are we going to see applications for flexible working under the Employment Rights Act, or are we going to introduce a home working policy? And if we are, how's that going to work? There are lots of issues around home working to think about and how that works, and also flexible working. You know, and that can be on a permanent or a temporary basis. And again, what are the rules going to be around flexible working? Maybe working core hours and then early in the morning or later in the evening to allow employees to deal with childcare issues. You know, how is a business going to deal with all of those? There's a huge amount of issues for HR teams to think about.
No, absolutely. I think that piece, as you've mentioned, Barry, around data and data security, you know, people using their own devices at home, licensing. I think there's some real issues there for our employers. And I think, you know, we've kind of been in panic mode, and I think in survival mode. I think now is the time to really think long term about how we can use our policies to really help and support our businesses. So again, if we can help with that, then do get in touch. Just as we click through, and I think that, you know, we shouldn't underestimate the impact on workplace culture that last year has had and will have moving forward. And whether this is positive or negative will really depend on the way your business has reacted. So, for example, did you put measures in place in a fair and timely way? Did you communicate with your staff? Did you have a collaborative approach? So, for example, where perhaps higher paid executives or directors took a bigger cut of pay, for example, than more junior staff? Did employees feel pressured into coming back to work? And what steps did you really put in place to support health and safety and well-being? And, you know, as we've mentioned as well about adaptability, and so how agile and adaptable were we at allowing our staff to work from home? For some, COVID-19 has sped up plans to get staff working remotely, and for others, it's changed your business's mindset to embrace flexible working.
So one issue is whether what's happened over the last 12 months is going to make businesses kinder or more adaptable to the needs of the way in which their people want to work. Will we also now want to work in an environment that allows for a work-life balance, so people don't have to change careers or employers? How's all that going to work out?
Absolutely, and I've heard and actually read quite a bit recently about perhaps with the majority of teams working from home, has there been a bit of levelling up? And I'm sure, we can think about situations perhaps personally where we know that decisions have been made or work has been shared or clients given out, where you or somebody wasn't in the office. And, a bit of that, a bit of out of sight, out of mind syndrome sort of creeps in. But now, perhaps with everybody working from home, others have realised what it's like to be at home or to work part of the time at home. So I think really as we drive forward with return to work plans, I think, going back to this point about equality of opportunity, and some really interesting ideas for employers there to think about to ensure that we sort of keep and maintain the sort of the levelling up approach.
So as we move through the next few months, reopening workplaces and the economy may involve some false starts where you may not be 100% operational. It will take time to ensure the health and safety measures in place to support our returners and also our home workers.
I think that's right, Barry, and I think, for me, if I could, put sort of core themes together and issues that I've seen, I think really it's first and foremost is around that communication piece. So really keeping yourself up to date as an organisation or an HR team, but also keeping your staff up to date so they know what the expectations are and what the timetable looks like for them as well. So really that communication piece, but also listening as well. How do your staff feel? Can we anticipate some of the issues that may arise? Those who've heard me talk before, I talk a lot about, not being that, trying to avoid that sort of firefighting. Know your people, know your teams, and try and anticipate where you can, where some of the issues might be. And I think as well about being that adaptable employer, that agile employer. Can we be flexible in the way that we approach the return to work? I think there's been a lot of good that has come out of the last year. So what can we learn from it? Is there a time that we need to sort of reflect and move forward, take away the good bits and work on the bits that perhaps didn't work so well? And how can we support our leaders? I think that's really important. How we can support our leaders and our managers at this time to really engage with their teams and to help and support them as well at this point. Our leaders don't know all the answers, and I think there's been this expectation that your manager will know everything. So I think if we can help and support our leaders and our managers, whether it's through training or mentoring and coaching, I think that's a really important consideration. For some, as we've said, they may not be returning to work, and I think we need to deal with those individuals sympathetically as well, and thinking about not just our legal obligations or our fair processes and our fair reasons through the redundancy process, but also talking to our individuals as fairly and sympathetically and humanly as well. They've been out of the business for a long time in some cases, so how can we think and put ourselves in the shoes of other people? And I think there's that balance, isn't there, as well? What can we do now in the short term, but also how we can support growth and employment in the long term, really echoing those points that Derek raised at the start.
Yes, there are a lot of unknowns, but what we do know is that as we look beyond lockdown, that the roadmap for change, employees are unlikely to be returning to the same workplace environments they left. Businesses that proactively consider these challenges now will be better placed to adjust quickly. So the Boys Turners Employment Group is open, and we're here to help and offer advice and support. We will be sending around our contact details, but again, if there are any questions that perhaps you want to raise offline, then please do so. I'm going to hand back to Derek now, and we've got a bit of time
Derek, just to deal with any questions that we've had during the presentation. Oh, we've had a mute fail.
Yeah. Back
there
in the
you
zone.
are.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Emma, and that's all. Thank you, Barry. I must say, it's a minefield. I've sort of listening to your presentation. There is so much to consider here. So I'm a leader. I look after a lot of staff, and sort of like I need to consider so much with people returning. I take totally on board, so the whole sort of being flexible and being very agile, sort of like as we go through the next few weeks, sort of like trying to pull people back into the workplace. So thank you so much. I've got a personal question actually. Just regards to sort of health and safety. Have you had any recent cases, sort of surrounding sort of going back into work?
Well, as we mentioned as we're going through, there was the case up in Leeds where the employee was trying to argue that he was at serious imminent risk of danger to himself and his family. But in that case, because the employer had followed the government guidance and had been very clear about what it had done, that although the employee could say that's what his personal feeling was, that was found not to be objectively reasonable, and so his claim failed. So it's really important, that employers, as they have employees coming back into the workplace, make sure they're operating COVID secure work environments, and that they follow and keep up to date with the changing government guidance.
I think that's really important, and also going back to that communication point as well. There was another case involving a lorry driver, and he was delivering product to site and he failed to comply with the client's, so not his employer's health and safety requirements or PPE requirements, but with the client's requirements. And the client said, well, I'm sorry, he's not coming to site anymore. He's failed to comply with our requirements. And the individual was actually dismissed, and the dismissal was found to be fair. So as well as keeping that communication, again, really think about not just what your obligations are as an employer, but also what obligations that potentially your clients and customers might have as well. Because I think it's really important not just to say, right, you need to comply with our obligations, but also client obligations, because if your people are not complying with client obligations, then you might find your client's going to say, well, I don't want them working on site. You need to find somebody else. So it's really important to really communicate what your obligations, and also training as well. It's really important. What are the expectations, and training is a really good way of doing that. That's
fair enough. Okay. Thank you both of you. I've got a few other questions here in the chat group from David. Should return to work interviews include a mental health question?
I think that's really quite difficult. I suppose you can ask people how they're getting on and how they're feeling and see where that goes. I don't think we should be asking people questions about their mental health if clearly there's nothing wrong with them, because that might in and of itself be seen to be a breach of the contract. But if you can talk to people about if they've been out of work on furlough for 9 months, you can ask them how they've coped, how they've been getting on, make sure they're in the right frame of mind to come back to work, and see how that conversation goes, rather than say, well, rather than ask the open question, are you depressed? Do you have any mental health issues? I'm not sure that's the right way to go, or the positive way to go.
I agree, and I think if you have it as a tick box, what does that achieve? It's like, hooray, I've asked the question. I think a lot of employers are really looking at offering not just those who are returning from furlough, but more generally some sort of awareness, be it sort of webinars or through your employee assistance programs, really around about returning to work and what that might look like. And it's okay to feel a bit apprehensive or anxious. So I would, rather than asking that sort of specific question, it might be better to actually offer some sort of training that people can go on as well to really, to show that you're catching everybody, and it's not just a, we've asked the question, tick the box.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you for that. I've got another question here. So our business now has a hot desk drop-in office. Everyone has the option to work from home at any time. Should contracts be changed?
Well, I think the important thing here is to make sure that the operation, the way in which the business is going to work, is very clear. So everybody needs to understand what is meant by you can work from home at any time. Do they still have to work core hours, office hours? What hours do they have to work? So it would be very helpful, I think, for there to be some clarity around that, either in the form of a letter which goes to the employees and says, well, this is how we're now operating, please agree, or please confirm if you do agree. Strictly, maybe you should be getting involved in consultation if there are a large number. But I think maybe you just ask the question, and if people then come back and say, we're very happy with that, you can go ahead and get on with it. If people are going to say, no, I want to come into the office and work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, then maybe you have to step back and start having some collective consultation around that and the change to the contract. But this seems to be a very positive change.
Yeah. Okay. Along similar lines, sort of from Leslie, sort of, everyone's back in her office on the 4th of May. Does she have to offer a home working option?
I think there's one word answer: no. You don't have to offer home working. If people can apply to work flexibly, and the flexible working can include a home working option, but you don't strictly have to offer the people the ability to work from home. Yeah.
I think it depends on the company itself, doesn't it? Okay. And so what stance do you see companies taking over the requirement to have a vaccination before returning?
I think, it's at this stage, I think it's just too early. I think, as I've said, there are a lot of contractual, legal, ethical, discrimination issues, and I think that certainly at the moment I would be advising to sort of look at things holistically, and also remember the vaccine isn't, it isn't the silver bullet. It does not negate the need for following health and safety or COVID secure measures. I think we will get to a sector specific, and it will be very, very specific sectors that may be able to have some sort of compulsory vaccination. But I think for the majority of employers, it will be looking at what other steps can we take to ensure health and safety, and also on top of that, the added layer of what are the COVID secure measures, which at the moment we don't know, and we expect the review a week before the 21st of June. So I think I would prefer a more holistic approach, looking at our sick pay as well. For example, if people are being encouraged to self-isolate, well, what does that look like for them? Do we have a generous, or could we look at maybe our sick pay scheme that could encourage those to self-isolate? What's the culture around presenteeism? Do we encourage those who are off, who are genuinely ill, to actually go and have some time away to get better? Or do we have this culture where we expect people to sort of drag themselves into work? So I think it's looking at everything in the round.
Okay, thank you both of you, and I think we're just about running out of time, so I'm gonna have to wrap it up there. I mean, thank you for those people who have sort of asked questions. Apologies if we haven't got around to your question. I'd like to thank Emma and Barry for a really insightful understanding of sort of like what it's going to be what it's looking like going back into the office. As I said at the beginning, sort of like we will send out a link to the recording, so you can refresh yourself or pass on to your colleagues. And I guess it only leaves me to sort of thank you once again for attending, and to keep safe. All right, thanks very much. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.